Hey, Greg, thank you so much. So finally, I can have you on my podcast. Such a pleasure having you here. Thank you for joining.
Well, it's great to be here, Gaurav. Thank you very much for inviting.
You know what? I read about your book, Cascades, several years back. How to create a movement that drives transformational change. And least did I expect that one day I would have you on my podcast. Such a pleasure. Thank you for making time.
That's very kind of you. Thank you.
Of course, we are going to talk about your book. We are going to talk about transformational change. We are going to talk about a lot of stuff. But, Greg, I would like to know you a little better. Why don't you share with our audience one of those memories from your past where you found it extremely difficult to adapt to change as a child, as a teenager, one of those early relationship, if I may call it, with change?
Well, I think probably my most important change experience, which I wrote about in the book, was the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, because it was one of those rare moments where the universe opens itself up and reveals a little bit of itself to you. And you realize that the world doesn't work the way you thought it did. And the Orange Revolution was exactly a moment like that, because at the time in Ukraine, there was a very, very clear power structure and how things work. And that's growing up in the United States. I figured, well, the world works a certain way, that there's certain centers of power. And that's the sort of framework we work within, that there's certain rules. And then all of a sudden, in the Orange Revolution, nobody with any conventional form of power had any ability to shape events at all. There's just seemed to be this mysterious force that nobody could describe, but nobody could deny, that was moving things along. I spent quite a bit of time, 15 years, trying to learn about that force and how you can leverage it to create the kind of change that's meaningful to you. And that's what became Cascades.
Just wondering, before you got into consulting work, and that too around change management, transformational change, you were heading organizations.
I was leading mostly media organizations in Eastern Europe.
Yeah. And as a leader, what do you think? What was the um, most fulfilling aspect that you enjoyed the most?
Well, it changed over time. Leadership is something that nobody can really teach you how to do. I mean, they have courses and you read books, but I think there's one essential um, piece of knowledge that you need to internalize to be an effective leader. And that is that you're going to make only the tough decisions. Because if a decision comes to you, by definition, it was something that nobody else could solve, or it would have been solved already. So you're going to have to make those decisions, and a certain amount of them are going to be wrong, and it's going to be your fault, and you're going to have to clean up the mess. And once you're able to internalize that and be able to make decisions and be decisive with that knowledge, that a lot of them are going to be wrong, but you still have to make the decision, then you can start being an effective leader. And then it stops being about you, because you begin to realize how little control you have over the situation. And I really think you need to be a leader to realize how powerless leaders are. Everybody thinks that once you get the top job, that you can do, and you can just tell people whatever you want, but that's not true at all.
Yeah.
Once you're able to make that leap from it's about me and me being smart and capable and all these things to everybody else, that's when you get to really get the joy of leadership, which is being able to empower others to achieve, to actualize themselves. And Immanuel Kant had this great notion of dignity, that you treat somebody with dignity when you treat them as ends in themselves rather than as a means to an end. Once you're able to do that, you can be an effective leader. Until you're able to do that, you cannot be an effective leader. Because if people see it as transactional, if people say, hey, this, I'm being treated as a means to an end, not an end in myself, well, they're going to reciprocate, right? But if they believe that you as a leader really want what's best for them, whether that means inside the organization or outside the organization, then they're really going to work for it.
Beautiful. I think the last 5 minutes itself, you have already thrown so many truth bombs. The first one is when you said that nobody can teach you leadership. And in just one shot, you have actually disarmed so many leadership development consultants, trainers, so many institutes, the Harvards of the world. And when you started talking about that, how powerless leaders are. And then I just loved it when you spoke about that, rather than looking at people as a means to an end, if we start to look at people as themselves, where they can actualize themselves, that's true leadership. Thank you, Greg.
I do want to point out that, leadership experts can be quite helpful, but as a reference, as a place to go when you're looking for solutions.
Precisely.
But they can't tell you what it feels like to be there on the spot and to have everybody depending on you and to understand the weight of that responsibility.
It's like saying that they can definitely share, they can definitely show you a direction, but you have to walk on that direction, reach at a particular destination that nobody has ever reached before you, because that's going to be your destination. And you have to experience what it feels like to be a leader in that particular space, because nobody else has experienced that space in your context, if I may.
Yeah, and just to put a little bit of an Indian spin on it, there could have been no Salt March without a Himalayan miscalculation.
Yeah.
Until Gandhi was able to really internalize that failure, he wasn't able to see the light. And that's why he had to go and meditate for weeks before he came up with the idea for the Salt March. And almost nobody thought that that was a good idea. We're going to march for salt. What's that? Right? It was only later when it started that people began to see, because he had internalized that struggle.
And since we're talking about Gandhiji, I think that's one of the biggest transformational movement that the world has witnessed, if not the most important.
It was the seminal one. I mean, the civil rights movement in America was very much based on Gandhi, not just Martin Luther King, but others who went to India to study.
Precisely.
Interestingly, though, Gandhi, he first learned from the suffrage movement, which he was exposed to in England.
Yeah. You know what, Greg, I was not expecting to get into this kind of a space with you so early in this conversation. I knew it. Having spoken to you a few times, I knew it will get to a space where I would get into this profound space. Our conversation would be thought-provoking. I knew it. There would come moments in this conversation when I would be experiencing and listening to silence like never before. I didn't expect that it'll come so early. Thank you for being who you are. Why am I sharing this? Because I've personally met a lot of people who call themselves change consultants. Several people. Very rare I've come across people like Greg, who have been able to define change in a way that people can relate to. Would love, just in your way, the way you explain things, Greg, if you can talk about what is transformational change and how is transformational change different from the change that we use loosely in our day-to-day conversations.
Well, my friend who's a global activist, Surja, he probably doesn't remember this, but it's something I've repeated a number of times. He said that a revolution is successful if it becomes mundane and ordinary. And he said, if you've done it right, it should be difficult to explain what was won because the previous order has become so unbelievable. And that is, not a tweak, but
Didn't I tell you that the way you explain things is a very different perspective for me? This reminds me of a conversation that Einstein was having with amateur journalists. Amateur journalists like me went to an Einstein, the scientist of your stature, and said, what is the most important equation that you can share with me? Or the most important question that you would like to ask me? And Einstein, to that question, said that, is the world a safe place to live in? And the journalist asked, I was expecting that you'll give me a scientific equation, you'll give me this. Einstein smiled and said, you know what? This is the most important question that we need to ask. That is the world a safe space to live? Because if the answer is yes, we are going to create bridges. If the answer is no, we are going to create fences. As you mentioned, if change is something that it becomes so mundane and ordinary that people find it difficult, how the world would be without that. It's like if you look at a change that happened when the wheel would have been invented for the first time, when people started to move, when there was a time before internet and after internet, right? I mean, we can't even imagine the world without internet. That's transformational change. How to create a movement that drives transformational change? I would like to double click on that because on several occasions, you have spoken about that there's a very specific kind of a mindset required in a leader to drive that change. What does that mean?
well, I think it's really important to create a sense of, very much to your point, to create a sense of safety around the change conversation. All too often, we talk about change as disruption, change is hard, we speak in terms of burning platforms and creating a sense of urgency around change. That's almost always a terrible idea, unless you're actually in the middle of a crisis. I talk about a lot about Lou Gerstner in um, in the book and in my other writing as well, because it was such an incredible transformation. He didn't have to create a sense of urgency around the change. Everybody knew that the company was in crisis. If you feel like you have to create a sense of urgency around the change, then that means that people don't see the need for change. But you need to create a sense of safety around the change. That's the only way you can really start building change on common ground. And that's the first big shift that you need to make, because when people are passionate about an idea, they want to focus on differentiating values, where if you're going to bring people in, you need to focus on shared values. So everybody has experienced a colleague who just got back from agile training or some kind of training, and they're saying, hey, we need to stop everything. We need to change, and they want to talk about the agile manifesto, which can seem strange or weird to most people who are not in the agile community. And you're not going to be successful trying to explain the agile manifesto to people. What you want to do is to create a bridge and talk about things that everybody cares about better products done faster and cheaper, increasing performance. And once you create a conversation around things that everybody sees value in, then you can start talking about agile or whatever as one possible avenue of achieving those goals.
Yeah. Yeah. It brings me back to what you mentioned about leaders and means to an end. Very similar point. Is my understanding right?
I think it's related.
Yeah.
Yeah. But here's the interesting thing. The best way we've found to identify shared values is to listen to what the skeptics are saying. Because if you are able to identify a common value in their objection, then you'll have a very, very powerful tool.
Wow.
And that's what Gandhi was so great at. Everybody thinks of Gandhi as this almost naive figure, when he wasn't naive at all. He was ruthless. And that's what made the Salt March work, was that it was a dilemma action. And you create a dilemma action. Here's the interesting thing about shared values. You can use them to bring people in. You can also use them to bludgeon your opponents. And that's what Gandhi figured out. He was one of the first people who had figured this out. Because you start with a shared value, this idea that the salt laws were genuinely unjust, which even people in England felt that way. I mean, it had been a subject in Parliament. So the idea of the salt laws being unjust was very much a shared value. And that's what most people didn't see. They looked and said the salt laws, because most of the revolutionaries, they were the more affluent Indians. So the salt tax didn't mean much to them.
Yeah.
But for everybody else, even among the English, the idea that the salt tax was unjust was a shared value. And then what you do is you create a constructive act rooted in that shared value. And that's what creates the dilemma. That's what Gandhi understood. When he started the Salt March, the Indians had a choice. They could either let the Salt March go through and let Gandhi and others boil water and manufacture salt, or they would have to violate the shared value and crack down.
Yeah. Yeah.
Either way, they were going to lose.
You made a very powerful statement. You said, listen to what skeptics are saying and identify the shared value in their objections. It's a very powerful statement in itself, Greg. Why? Because, when I'm perceiving somebody as a skeptic and not a supporter of the idea that I'm bringing in, don't you think that's a natural tendency to get blinded with my own biases? Now, how can I keep those biases aside and look for that golden nugget, that look for that shared values in that skepticism? How can I do that?
You make it a reflex. It's almost like a mantra. Where's the shared value? And I'll give you some examples. In the LGBTQ movement in the United States for decades, they were focusing on difference. We're here, we're queer, we'd like to say hello. We are different, and we want to be accepted for those differences. And for decades, anytime they made even a little gain, they got hammered back, because people would talk about family values and defense of marriage. And how did they win? When they said, yes, we want those things too. We want to live in committed relationships. We want to raise happy and healthy families just like you. Once you make that bridge, then people are willing to accept the difference because they see the commonality. A similar thing with something like agile or any of these, whether it's design thinking or whatever change people are going to make.
modality that we're talking about. Yeah.
So generally speaking, when people are resistant to, let's say, agile development, what people get is, first of all, a lot of the resistance is based on identity. I've done things in a certain way. I consider myself a good product manager, and I've done things in a particular way, and I'm proud of the job I've done. I identify with that work, and I'm attached to the way I work. That sense of attachment is incredibly important, because when people feel their attachments are threatened, they're going to lash out. Now, usually when it comes to agile, they'll make some sort of performance argument. They'll say, well, I'm performing and this is what works and I know what works. Well, then if you're looking for a shared value, you can say, well, yeah, I want things to work as well. So if you're talking less about agile and more about performance, well, then the agile people are going to be much more willing to accept the agile methodology if they can see that it leads to performance.
Beautiful.
I'm going to lead with performance rather than trying to push somebody to immediately accept the agile manifesto, because you don't need to convince everybody at once. We know from decades of research that the tipping point for change is amazingly low, somewhere between 10 and 25% in an organization. So we don't need to convince everybody. We don't even need to convince a majority.
Yeah. Yeah.
We need to convince a small but significant minority.
I just love the way you explain things. I mean, you make things so simple, Greg. In a very simple way, you have just explained right now that every time when there's skepticism around me, a very simple question that I need to ask myself, I just need to distance myself from the situation and ask this question in my mind, that where is the shared value? Because rather than looking at the differences, if I start to look at where is the shared value, I would give it a very different spin altogether. That's one. Then you mentioned something so powerful. You said resistance comes from identity.
Well, it can. It's not the only place.
Wow.
As you know, one of the first things we do when we work with an organization about change is we go through what we call a resistance inventory. And we've identified 5 categories of resistance. The first is lack of trust, which is a completely rational objection, right? That I don't trust you. You're not treating me as an end in myself. You're treating me as a means to an end. You're pushing this change. I don't see that this change will benefit me. I think it will benefit you. So that's the first one. The second is change fatigue, right? Well, we've just had, over the past 5 years, we've had 10 change initiatives, and we're constantly launching them, and they all fail, and you never stick with them. So, and I'm tired. I'm just sick of hearing about change all the time when I'm just trying to do my job. The third category is competing incentives or commitments. So a competing incentive is external. I'm being paid to do one thing, and now you're asking me to do something else. So I'm incentivized to do one thing, and I'm being asked to do something else. A competing commitment is internal. So you can imagine a manager who is being asked to delegate authority, but they see themselves as being very hands-on, and they pride themselves on that. That would be a competing commitment. The fourth is switching costs. So any change involves some type of switching costs. So those are 4 very, very rational, reasonable reasons why people resist change. And you can go through and you can think about how those categories of resistance, how they're going to how they're likely to manifest themselves and how they can be mitigated. And you want to do this exercise in the beginning. You don't want to only think about resistance when you incur it. But it's that fifth one. It's that fifth one that that's going to trip you up. That resistance related to identity, dignity, and sense of self. So I'm going to go through just an exercise that I like quite a bit.
Yeah.
So imagine,
before we get there, Greg, in my mind, what I'm listening right now is that two of them they are very technical in nature, which is competing incentives and commitments, as well as switching cost. And the remaining three, they are very, very intrinsic in nature. And every person would respond to that in a very different way. I'm just parking it right now. We'll come back to the activity and then I'll talk more about that. Would love to understand more about that. Over to you. Let's talk about the activity that you were talking about.
imagine that you're in a conference room and say there's 8 or 10 people in the meeting and something has been proposed. And over the course of an hour, the group goes steadily towards a consensus. And at the end of the meeting, when you're moving on to next steps, all of a sudden, somebody who hadn't said anything the entire time throws a hissy fit in the middle of the conference room and completely discredits themselves. I'm sure you've seen this situation before.
Yes.
It's very, very common. But think about why that happens. When the proposal first came up, it violated some attachment. And that person had such a visceral reaction to it, they couldn't even articulate their objection. And it's important to understand that these aren't bad people. In fact, we all do this. Anybody who's ever been part of a family knows that we all do this, right? But they were unable to articulate their objection, but they were sure that somehow it would get derailed. And it was the moving to next steps that triggered them. And that's really important to realize, because it's the progress that it's seeing change gain traction that causes them to lash out. Another important insight we get from this example, usually they don't have the hissy fit. Usually they're able to keep their composure and the meeting ends and they start sabotaging you on the hallways. And the third thing is, any major change happens not when your deepest opposition is convinced, but when they discredit themselves. And that's what happened in the Salt March. No, Salt March didn't convince anybody of anything, but it caused the British to discredit themselves. And that's what a dilemma action does. And that's what, when you're talking about change, people are often going to say, oh, well, they'll never be convinced. Some people will never be convinced. And that's the wrong way of thinking. People who oppose your idea, they can be convinced. They might not be convinced to see things your way, but they can be convinced to discredit themselves and help you in that way. And learning to leverage your opposition is the most effective thing that you can do.
Learning to leverage your opponents, you said, right?
Learning to leverage your opposition.
Opposition, yeah. I think that's where the strength is, right? And if we can learn that art, we can actually change the entire game.
First, you identify shared values.
Yeah.
And that's how you create safety around the change conversation. Once you do that, your opponents derailing those shared values is what will discredit them.
Yeah.
And it will make them furious.
Yes. Wow. Let me just go back to the resistance part that you were talking about, resistance to change. I think that's a very important aspect that you picked up, where you spoke about the trust part of it, right? The lack of trust. In an organization, when you're working, And trust is becoming a very important area of concern for most of the leaders. I'm just wondering, lack of trust can happen because one person can have trust issues, or it can also happen because the person that I'm dealing with is not able to create that psychologically safe space for me. How do we identify that in this situation, I need to work on my trust issues rather than expecting the other person to create a psychologically safe space for me?
Well, again, it keeps coming back to values, and everybody has them, right? Every organization has values. Some are shared, some are not. But values need to have a litmus test. For something to truly be a value, you need to be able to accept costs and constraints. If you're unwilling to be constrained by your values, then it's just a bunch of stuff that you want. Going back to Lou Gerstner, he said he wanted to value the customer, was one of the chief values. Anybody can say they value the customer. They value excellence. They value all these things. But what does it cost you? And Gerstner answered that question. He said, I'm willing to forego revenue on every sale in order to make good on that value. I've interviewed dozens of IBM executives from that period. They all point to that, and not one of them thinks that IBM would still be in business if it wasn't for that. So being able to incur costs. So when I say I value my people as ends in themselves rather than as means to an end, I have to ask, what's that going to cost me? Well, how do you treat people when they leave the company? How do you create policies that show that it's true? What work have you done up until that point to show that you value them as ends in themselves? And that's how you build trust over time. If you have not built that trust, or you've done something that would make people question that trust, such as you just launched a failed change initiative last year, which would give people reason to not trust that you're going to stick with this one. Well, that needs to be addressed in some way. You can't just act like it isn't there.
As I'm just listening to you, I'm reflecting on my journey as a leader in my organization. And the only statement which is sticking so true to me is that leadership is not an easy journey. It's not at all an easy journey, right? And at the same time, we don't realize is that how powerless a leader is. I'm going back to the statement that you mentioned, and requires a lot of work on self to walk on this path of leadership. Would love to hear from you, since you have interviewed so many leaders, Greg. You have driven so many change movements in organizations. You have spoken about how to create movement that drives transformational change. What, according to you, is so unique in leaders who are able to drive change?
I don't think it's that unique. I'll tell you one story about a woman who came to work for us. Wonderful woman, but she had a terrible interview. Her entire interview, she was complaining about her former job and her former boss. And to be honest, I still don't know why I hired her, because that would usually mean I wouldn't hire somebody like that. But for whatever reason, I saw something in her, so I hired her. And then the very first day, I asked her to do something, and we had given, her our values. At the end of the day, I asked if it was done, and she said no, and she started blaming somebody else. And I said, no, we don't do that here. Just tell me it wasn't done and get it done tomorrow. I don't want to hear you throw somebody else under the bus. And she immediately, it's like the scales fell from under her eyes, because that was something that was in the values. And she saw that we really meant it. And she became one of the best employees we ever had. And she moved very, very fast in our company. And then she left us very soon, after about a year, because she'd won a scholarship to study in Germany. And this was in Ukraine, so it was a really big deal. And she had said that she would never have applied for that scholarship if she hadn't gotten this job. It just changed her idea of what is possible. And she's gone on to a very, very successful career.
Wow.
But think about how that changes, how everybody else sees things, right? And before she was leaving, she was telling everybody how this job had changed her life. So it was just a small thing, but it's the small things that matter. Sometimes it's just as simple as seeing somebody who is having a tough day, or seeing somebody's off on one day and then seeing it 2 or 3 days in a row and bringing them in and trying to figure out what the problem is and letting them know that they have your support. All of those things mean, all the difference in the world. And I think it's so important to understand your power as a leader, that what you say and what you do will affect others. And once you're able to internalize that, you're able to make it as something positive, that this is not somebody who's going to discipline me, but this is somebody who can, who supports me. One management device that I found incredibly effective was I would ask each of my direct reports, and it was something I learned from my first job in the States, this idea of never go down alone. That if I know everything you're doing, you can't get blamed for it because you're not going down alone. I knew about it. So it's just as much my fault as it is yours.
Yeah. Yeah.
All of my direct staff to never go down alone reports every Friday. So it could be as long or short as they wanted. Took them a little bit to get the hang of it because they would do like an inventory of activity I did. But once they understood it, and they understood it shouldn't take you more than 10 or 15 minutes to do, because you're only telling me what you need to tell me so that you don't go down alone. And creating safety around it, that whatever is in that report, you can't get blamed for because I know about it. So you're not going down alone. And then they really started to like it, because it was a way of really thinking through the issues and putting in front and alerting themselves, thinking about what's really important and prioritizing, sending me just a few things. And then what was interesting is then they started doing it with their own staff. The 10 or 12 reports turned into hundreds, that the sort of anthill was transmitting these messages, and they were all getting distilled into 10 or 12 very short reports.
Yeah. Since you're talking about taking somebody along, in fact, in your book, Cascades, right, you have spoken about networking the movement. During our last conversation, you spoke about the importance of having allies with you and weaving the network. Tell me more about that. How can we build a network while we are creating a movement that's going to stick for years to come?
Change is always about empowerment. You're allowing people to take ownership for their own reasons, which might be different than yours. And as you know, I repeat many times in the book that it's always about small groups loosely connected, united by a shared purpose. So as leaders, it's our job to help those groups connect and to inspire them with purpose. That's your job as a leader, to enable other people to bring change forward, not to push the change yourself. That's why it is rare that you want to try and drive change in terms of incentives. You want to start change with people who are already enthusiastic about it. Empower them to be successful, And that's what will attract others who can attract others still. But that's a really important thing, because another thing typical change management projects focus on a lot is the internal communication or the external communication strategy, how they're going to explain this change, creating awareness about the change. But we know from decades of research that change is socially transmitted, that communication can seed it, but the way it spreads is from peer to peer. And that can only be done through networks. So rather than trying to come up with the right slogan and deliver it in the right way, you're going to be much better served by helping change work for people, helping them be successful. And they'll go and communicate that success themselves.
Thank you, Greg, for sharing that. These days, the world is talking about artificial intelligence, right? Yesteryear, people were talking about blockchain. They were talking about NFT. So there are spikes of technologies that come up and go down. And if you look at all those new technologies coming in, there are only few companies which have been able to imbibe change and stick to that change. What do you think? What is it that companies can do to, one, foresee change, second, drive change, third, adapt to change and sustain and grow?
Well, again, it comes down to establishing shared values so that people see this technology or method, whether it's AI or something else, it's about something that I value. So AI, how is it going to give me something that I value? Chat GPT or whatever it is. And creating some sense of safety. It's going to be able to make me do my job better. It's going to make my life easier. It's going to help me achieve what I want to achieve. So there needs to be that shared value. And then from shared value, you need to ladder up to shared purpose.
Makes sense.
You do that with, and there's a whole chapter in the book, by identifying a keystone change.
Yeah.
A first initial change that achieves a concrete and tangible goal that involves multiple stakeholders and will lead the way to further change. And again, the Salt March in Gandhi's movement was that keystone change. It wasn't the change in itself, but it showed everybody that change was possible.
Yeah. Super. Greg, thank you so much. And I would strongly recommend everyone who's listening to this podcast to pick up this book called Cascades: How to Create a Movement That Drives Transformational Change. And I promise you're going to love that. You are just going to love that. I was in awe of the concepts that Greg has mentioned in this book. And you've already heard Greg talking about in the simplicity, the way he explains things. Greg, thank you so much.
I'm looking forward to it as well.
Thank you so much. Take care.